Hi all and welcome back to our series of lessons on an inspector calls. Today we're going to be looking at the last of the character sessions that I'm going to do, which is looking at the character of the inspector. Now this one obviously can be slightly different. The majority of the character profiles that we've been considering have been looking at character flaws, and we've been looking at the ways in which the negative characteristics of each of those characters are portrayed. So for example, Mr. Burden, we looked at his arrogance and his selfishness. We looked at his obsession with business. With the inspector, we've got a much more enigmatic character. We don't learn as much about the inspector as we do about the other characters, and there's a lot of unanswered questions about who he is, what his purpose is, and ultimately whether he's even a human being at all. So it's going to be an interesting video to have a look at his character and his role within the play. Same as always, we've got some vocabulary for you to have a look at, which is just to explore the character of the inspector. A lot of this is to do with his almost supernatural nature, almost religious nature, things like his ability to preach messages or his ability to prophesize and predict the future. So it's really useful just to start to familiarise yourself with this language, because this is going to be helpful when you come to do an analysis, which we'll be looking at in the next video. Okay, let's begin with the inspector. As a character, he is, as I said in the first part there, an enigmatic part of the play. He is meant to be there as a mystery. He is the link that turns this into a story that is reminiscent of detective fiction. He's there to solve a crime. He's there to piece together the bits of the puzzle. However, his role is much more than you would expect in a piece of detective fiction, where he's there to judge the characters and question their morality. He's not just investigating any criminal proceedings and investigating the death. What he's doing is he's forcing these characters to introspectively reflect on their own behaviours, to discuss their own morals, and to ultimately come to decisions about their own behaviour, how they feel they have responded to this girl, this character of Eva Smith, who could well be a creation of the inspector, piecing together small parts of other stories. Personally, I don't think so. Personally, I think it is one person that has been affected by all of the characters. However, the fact that question still exists tells you a lot about the inspector's role within the play. More so than any other character, Priestley's big ideas are expressed through the inspector. The inspector's been described as Priestley's mouthpiece, which means that he's Priestley's voice within the play. Priestley's socialist messages come through the inspector's interrogations, his beliefs, his ways of challenging the characters in the play. So when Mr. Berlin is prophesying about the continued rise of capitalism, that's the point that the inspector interjects. When Mr. Berlin is talking about how he refused, of course, the request for a wage increase, the inspector is there to challenge that, to say, why did you do these things? Likewise, the inspector is there to force these characters to reflect on their own personalities, to reflect on their own behaviour, and Priestley is using the inspector to critique society. He's using the inspector as his character, as his voice within the play, to critique capitalism, to critique the role of social class in British society in 1912 and in 1945 when this play is written, and also to criticise not necessarily the elderly, but the older generation, who have this stubbornness and this unwillingness to change or accept new ideas. As previously mentioned in that last section, the inspector could be perceived to be Priestley's mouthpiece within the play. He's Priestley's point of view and Priestley's perspective on society being projected and almost preached to us as an audience, and certainly to the Burlings as characters. The inspector's most powerful phrase potentially within the entire play is, "We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other." Now, this is a really significant quote that we need to understand, and we need to explore this metaphor a little bit more. So the fact that if you are members of one body, it's almost like a biblical allegory where the body is made up of all the different parts, and they have to all work in harmony for the body to remain healthy. Therefore, being members of one body, we are responsible for each other. This directly contrasts with Mr. Berlin's view about community and all that nonsense, whereas the inspector challenges this when Mr. Berlin says it would be very awkward if we were responsible for each other. The inspector says, yes, very awkward. Likewise, the inspector's phrase, "it is better to ask for the earth than to take it," can be seen as a direct attack on capitalism and on greed. The fact that he is defending the lower class, working class characters who are asking for a pay rise, and challenging someone like Mr. Berlin, this egocentric capitalist who is taken from society, is quite powerful and quite indicative of Priestley's point of view. Similarly, when Sheila is surprised at the way that Eva Smith's living, the inspector responds that there are young girls like this in every big town and city in this country. There are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still with us. One of the inspector's most important characteristics is his refusal to be intimidated. We see him refer consistently throughout the play to doing his duty, suggesting his stoic nature. He has a task and he's going to steadfastly continue to do this no matter what the opposition is. We spoke about this briefly with Mr. Berlin when we looked at his character and how he's obsessed with status, things like the fact that he is on the bench, was an alderman, the fact that he's in line for a knighthood. And one way he does this is by referencing the chief inspector and how they play golf regularly. The inspector's famous phrase, "I don't play golf," shows that he has little to no regard to social status, and Mr. Berlin can't use that to intimidate him. Likewise, Mrs. Berlin quite regularly says to him, "I don't like your tone," and she refers to him as impertinent when the inspector dares to challenge her point of view and her perspectives and the way that she sees the world. After he left, Mrs. Berlin says he didn't behave like a police inspector at all. He has this driven nature and he refuses to bow to the intimidation that some of the Berlings and Gerald Croft try to put on him. One way to approach a reading of the inspector as a character is to consider his role as an entity beyond the human. He's not just a simple police inspector from Brumley, even though that is what he appears to be. He has this higher power and he has this higher authority. Probably the most simple way of looking at this is the fact that his name itself of Goole is a pun on the word Goole, meaning spirit, which could suggest some sort of ghostly or otherworldly intention there from Priestley. Similarly, he seems to have all the information that he needs already, and his purpose there is not to actually interrogate the Berlins. Sheila even remarks that we hardly ever told him something that he didn't already know. The purpose of the inspector, therefore, becomes a much more moral one. Could he be a representation of conscience? Could he be a representation of the Berlings and Gerald's guilt and a physical manifestation of this, forcing them to reflect on their own behaviour? We can also argue that Priestley presents the inspector as almost like a religious figure. At the end of the play, when he's summing up his feelings towards the Berlings, he says that one thing we can share in is our guilt, and he uses lots of biblical metaphorical language talking about being members of one body. The fact he feels that he's able to speak for the millions and millions of working class people in the world, evidently the inspector has a higher social responsibility than just a simple policeman. For a character who doesn't appear until almost halfway through Act 1 and then leaves nearly halfway through Act 3, the Inspector leaves a massive impression across the text. He is the central focus of the play, and the action revolves around him and his interrogation and the way that the different characters respond to him, whether that be through their challenging behaviour and the way that they refuse to take responsibility, like Mr. Burling or Mrs. Burling, for example, or characters who are more reflective, such as Sheila and Eric. After the Inspector leaves, as the discussion turns to who he actually was, Mrs. Burling is quite shocked by the way he spoke to Mr. Burling and me. She focuses on his behaviour rather than her own. On the other hand, we have characters like Sheila and Eric. Eric, my God, I am not likely to forget. Sheila, he inspected us all right. The way that the Inspector has behaved towards them has left a much more lasting impression. Sheila has probably the greatest respect for the Inspector and says, I'm not able to forget the way that he spoke and the way that he made me feel. Ultimately, the Inspector has had a huge effect on the characters and the ways in which they respond to him, whether that be trying to challenge his behaviour and find fault in what he's done, or a more personal response where they're reflecting on their own behaviours, is up to the individual characters, and that's part of Priestley's core message. When considering the Inspector on stage, we have to consider him as someone who is going to be taking control of the situation, someone who is going to be creating a huge impression, as we discussed in that previous section. In Priestley's stage directions, the Inspector is described as a man in his 50s in a suit of the time. However, someone who creates an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. Now this is significant for across the play, as we need to see the Inspector taking control of the situation. He uses quite a lot of imperatives. Listen to me is an important one that he uses to create that air of solidity, that air of control. And likewise, he cuts in massively and he takes control masterfully. These important stage directions are useful to have a look at in the way that the Inspector is taking control of the situation, the way that he is the central focus, and Priestley's creating an impression of this is the man who we need to be listening to as an audience. Okay, this is the final set of character questions that we're going to be having a look at, obviously based on the Inspector. The next video that I'm going to be putting up is going to be looking at some responses to these individual questions and how we can go about improving our writing tasks. Same as last time, the first two are simple character analysis, looking at their key characteristics and their key role within the play. The second two involve a little bit more thought, a little bit more debate, and will be more reflective, making you think about your opinions on the character and how you can justify your answers with that. Okay, for the film recommendation today, I'm going to go for a film that I actually took a group of, I think, about 80 or 90 Year 11 students to go and see at the cinema when it was out, and it is one of the great epics of its age. It's got one of the greatest conclusions to any storyline that I've ever seen put to screen, and that's Toy Story 3. It's an amazing film. It's got a fantastic heartfelt story, and not to put a spoiler in there, but the scene where the toys all join hands together is probably one of the most impactful things I've ever seen in a cinema, and having to escort 80 Year 11s home, some in tears, was quite an experience. So if you haven't seen it already, I would suggest the whole first trilogy to start with, but Toy Story 3 is a fantastic film. until next time, I hope you stay safe. Like I said, we will be looking at some more essay based stuff, so the video will be slightly different next time, but until then, take care.